Introducing Server Core. Security has always been a hotly debated topic, especially where Microsoft operating systems are concerned. There's a lot of people that are really anti-Microsoft security, and in all honesty, Microsoft's track record over the years hasn't exactly been the best. But in Microsoft's defense, especially in the last few years, they've really made some great leaps towards providing much tighter security in their products. Now, some of these changes have been welcomed, such as including a firewall and turning it on by default. Now, others haven't been embraced by everyone, particularly newer things like user account control, which has had a mixed reaction, but no one can really argue that it isn't for the greater good. But something which has received almost unanimously positive reviews is a new feature of Windows 2008 called Server Core. Server Core is still Windows Server at heart, but it does away with all of the GUI components that we don't really need and leaves you with a stripped down, streamlined version of Windows that's managed either from a command prompt or remote management tools. This means that Windows 2008 is smaller, faster, and more secure than ever before, since all of the unnecessary bloat, if you like, has been removed. So unlike Microsoft Office that gets bigger and bigger with every release, Windows Server has gone on an optional diet, and only the essential things that we really need to run a server are left. So by doing away with all of the unnecessary things, Microsoft has reduced the attack surface of the Windows operating system. And you'll probably hear that term being thrown around a lot. And what reducing the attack surface means is to reduce the areas of a computer that's vulnerable to being attacked. So for argument's sake, not all servers need the print spooler service running. Not all servers need to utilize printing at all. So if you don't need it, the best thing you can do is turn it off altogether, and that'll close off one area of attack. After all, if there aren't certain things running on a server, you can't attack it. Now this same idea, of course, can be applied to all of the other applications and services that might run on a server that you don't really need. So by knowing what features to enable or disable, all works in your favor, reducing the available areas that a malicious user can attack. Or in other words, you're reducing the attack surface of the computer. Now, although this might be a little bit difficult to read at this resolution, we've included a comparison of the base services that you might expect to find on both a Server Core installation of Windows 2008 and a regular installation of Windows Server 2008. Now, at the top here are the services that are running on a Server Core build by default, and at the bottom are the default regular GUI installation of Windows 2008, with all the extra services that the GUI loads are highlighted in yellow. Now, I will point out though that this comparison was done on two machines that were installed and both added to a domain with no roles installed on either machine, but since both machines have been installed into a virtual Hyper-V server, you'll note that there are a few Hyper-V services running. So if you're running your server on a physical machine, not a virtual one like this comparison was done on, then you won't expect to see any of these additional Hyper-V services. And if you take a look at our video on the security configuration wizard, you'll learn how to reduce this even further to only critical services that you really need to let your server do its job. Now, the requirements for Server Core are less than you'll need for a normal version of Windows Server 2008. You're only going to need a minimum of 512 megabytes of RAM, with 1 gig being the recommended amount, 10 gig of hard disk space, although Server Core only takes a little over a gig, but 10 gig is the recommended minimum, since you'll need more space for installing roles on the server, as well as service packs, and so forth. Now, you'll also need at least a 1 gigahertz CPU as well, and the standard other components of a DVD drive, keyboard, mouse, and a monitor that's capable of running 800 by 600 resolution. Now, all of these requirements are the minimums, and they are pretty low, so even the oldest hardware that you have lying around nowadays should be able to exceed this pretty easy. Now, there's 9 different roles that you can utilize with a Server Core server, ranging from Active Directory domain services, DNS, DHCP, all the way down to virtualization and IIS, and we'll be talking more about some of these roles in later videos. Although something that you're not likely to see in the short term at least are things like SQL Server or Exchange Server being made available on a core server installation, since these applications are dependent on other Windows components that are only available with the full Windows GUI installation. Now, in addition to all of the things we've already talked about, Microsoft also claim that a Server Core installation will require less updates, and that's likely to be true if there's less things running on it, but they also claim that a server core installation is easier to manage. Well, if you're a natural command line junkie, you might agree with them, but since most Windows administrators are orientated towards the GUI, I wouldn't say that I agree with Microsoft that server core is easier to manage. Personally, I think that for most people it's always easier to use the GUI, but at the end of the day, you can manage both a server core server and a regular Windows server using the command prompt or the GUI. It's just that in the case of the server core server, you'll need to use GUI management tools from another server remotely. So, is it easier to manage a server core server? In my opinion, no, it's not. It's pretty much the same really, but since you can log on to a GUI on a normal server and manage everything locally, I'd lean towards the normal server being easier. But easier of course doesn't mean better though, so whether you think the server core build is easier or harder to maintain really isn't relevant in the overall scheme of things. Server core is certainly more secure and it's more streamlined, and that's what it's really all about. Alright, well enough talking about it, let's go and install a copy of Windows 2008 Server Core and we'll see what all the fuss is about. Okay, well I've gone ahead and I've placed our Windows 2008 DVD in the drive, and it'll boot up to the installation prompt you see here, which is basically identical to what you'll expect to see with a Windows Vista installation. So I'm going to leave all these defaults as they are, with an English language and our time and currency format in English as well, and we'll click Next, and then we'll click on Install Now. Okay, well now we can choose what sort of installation we want to perform, and since this is going to be a server core installation, I've got three choices here to install: a standard edition, an enterprise edition, or a data center edition. So I'm going to choose the middle one, enterprise, and then we'll click Next. And now we'll need to accept the terms of the license agreement, so we'll check the box here and we'll click Next again. Now since this is a new server, we only have one option here, and that's to choose a custom installation, so we'll click Custom, and then I'll just accept the default to install Windows Server Core on this drive here, and we'll click Next, and now Windows Server Core will begin installing. And that's it really. There's not a lot of options we'll get when we install Windows 2008 Server Core. Everything else we'll need to configure after the installation is complete. Now this will take a while as you'd expect, so I'm going to pause the video here and we'll return once the installation of Windows 2008 Server Core is complete. Alright, we're back. Windows 2008 Server Core's been installed, so we'll have to log in now. And you'll note here that we'll need to log in as another user. And because this is our first time logging in, we're going to log in with the administrator account and no password. So we'll just hit enter, and you can see here that we're told that our password must be changed before we log on, so we'll click OK. And now we'll go and type in a new password, and we'll type it in again just to confirm it. And there's our password being changed, so we'll click on OK. And this is going to log us in to our Server Core desktop. Now, strangely, this does take a while to prepare the desktop, and I say strangely because once our desktop does appear, all we basically have is a command prompt, but be prepared, you're going to have to wait a little while for this desktop to be prepared here, so we'll pause the video, we'll be back in a moment. Alright, well we're back. Windows 2008 Server Core is up and running, and we're presented with basically all you'll ever expect to see in Server Core, and that's this wonderful black command prompt. So, for those of you that have grown up on Microsoft operating systems and using the Windows GUI for configuration, you might be feeling like it's the first time you ever installed Linux and wondered what you need to do next. So to some of you, it probably seems like a massive step backwards right now, but nothing could be further from the truth. Sure, we've taken all of the latest technology and we've hidden it behind this command prompt. But this is a major step forward in both performance and security, and as we move forward in these videos, you'll learn how to configure Server Core, and hopefully you'll embrace it like I'm sure that so many of you will. Now, since we've just installed Windows 2008 Server Core, there are a couple of things you'll probably want to do straight away before we even think about installing any roles on this server, and that's to change the host name. We'd want to assign this server an IP address, and most likely join this server to our domain. So let's see how we can do these things now. So if we type in hostname and we'll hit enter, at this time we only have a randomly generated hostname assigned to this server, as we didn't get a chance to set it during the installation of Server Core. So to change it, we'll need to use the netdom command followed by rename computer, and then we'll need to enter in the name of this server, and we can either enter in the real host name or just type in localhost, which is certainly easier, but I will point out that in server call we can still cut and paste from the command prompt. So if we right click and we'll choose mark, and that'll let us highlight our host name here, and then we'll hit enter and that'll copy it to the clipboard, and then we'll just right click and choose paste. Now finally, for this command to work, we need to enter in the new host name that we want to change this server to. So we'll add in the new name switch followed by a colon and then the name that we want to change this server to, and I'm going to call this one SO1, and we'll hit enter, and then we're asked to confirm our choice of renaming this server to SO1. So I'll type in a Y for yes, and we'll hit enter, and then it's done. Now we will need to restart this server for the change to take effect, but before we go and do that, let's change our IP address as well. So we'll type in ipconfig and we'll hit enter, and you can see here that we do have this APIPA address assigned to our network adapter. So to change it to a static address, we'll use the netsh command. So we'll type in netsh and we'll hit enter, and then we'll type in IN for interface and we'll hit enter again, and then IP for IPv4 and hit enter one more time. Now we'll want to configure the IP address for this server, so we'll type in set address, and then we'll need to choose which interface that we want to change the IP address on. So the interface that we want to change is local area connection, and you'll simply find that name of that adapter up here. We want to set this to a static address, and I'll give it the address of 10.32.0.10, followed by a subnet mask of 255.224.0.0, and the last thing we'll need to enter in is the default gateway, which will be 10.32.0.1. So now we'll hit enter, and we'll go back and we'll spell the word address correctly, and that'll help. So we'll hit enter again, and then it's done. Now the next thing we'll need to configure is the DNS server for this server as well. So we're going to type in set DNS server, and I'll just double check to make sure I've spelt that one correctly. And again, we'll need to set the interface, which will be the local area connection. We'll also set this to a static address of 10.32.0.2, and this is going to be our primary DNS server. So we'll hit enter, and our DNS server is now being configured. So let's type exit, and that'll get us out of the netsh command. And if we type in ipconfig/all and hit enter here, now at the top here we can see that we have configured our interface with a static IP address, and we should see that the default gateway and DNS addresses are also pointing to the correct place. So let's quickly test it. We'll try and ping our domain controller, and that domain controller is called DC01, so we'll ping that, and we can see that it's all replying fine. Alright, well that's all looking good now, so we'll go ahead and we'll restart this server. So to do that from the command prompt, we'll use the shutdown command, and we'll add in the -R switch so our server will restart, and then we'll use the -T switch followed by a 1 so our server begins to shut down and restart after 1 second. Now we'll pause the video here and we'll be back in just a moment. Alright, well our server's now back up, so next thing we'll need to do is to join it to our domain, and for that we'll be using the netdom command. So we'll enter in netdom join followed by the name of this server, which is now SO1, but we could just use the word localhost here as well, and then we'll add in /domain, and then follow that up with the name of our domain, which is winstructorlab.com. Now we'll hit enter, and it's done. And again, as it says, we'll need to restart this server for this to take effect. So again, we're going to use the shutdown command with the -R switch, so our server's going to restart. And like before, we'll use the -T switch, followed by a 1, so our server begins to shut down and restart after 1 second. So we'll pause the video here, and again, we'll be back in a moment. Now in the meantime, whilst our core server is restarting, I've just switched over to my domain controller here, DC01. So we'll go and click on Start, and we'll go to Administrative Tools, And at the top we'll launch Active Directory users and computers. And if we expand our domain here, winstructorlab.com, and we select the computers container, over here on the right you can see that server 01 or S01 has now been added to our domain. So we can verify that our attempt to add our core server from the command prompt was in fact successful. Okay, our server core server, server 01, is back up and running, and now I want to touch on another thing that you'll probably need to know, and that's how to enable remote desktop access to this machine. You see, in a lot of cases, if you install a role such as a domain services role or DHCP or IIS on this server core server, you can remotely manage it from the GUI tools on another machine, and that's fine, and it's probably what a lot of you will be doing for day-to-day management of any roles you install on top of server core. However, you'll probably find that you'd still like to be able to remotely access the command prompt and access this so-called desktop using remote desktop. So at our command prompt to enable remote desktop access, we'll enter in cscript, followed by our window directory, system32, scregedit.wsf, followed by a /AR switch, and then the number 0. Now we'll hit enter, and this will update the registry, which will allow Windows Vista and Windows 2008 machines to access this server using remote desktop. However, if you want Windows XP and Windows 2003 machines to be able to access this server core server using remote desktop, then you'll need to rerun the same command again, but just change the last part here from an AR0 to a CS0. And then you can hit enter again, and now we'll be able to access this machine using remote desktop from a machine that's running XP, Vista, 2003 or 2008. Now the final thing I want to talk about in this video here is how to activate a Windows 2008 server core installation, since you won't get any sort of reminder popping up telling you to activate it. But of course, depending on what sort of version of Windows 2008 you're installing, in many cases you will need to activate it with Microsoft. So if we type in slmgr, this will fire up the Windows Software Licensing Management tool, and it'll show us all of the switches that we can use to run with this script. So from this window here, you can see a whole bunch of different options we have with this command. For example, IPK, which allows us to install a product key. And do take note that this will replace any key that you might have already entered. But you might also recall that when we installed Server Core, we'll never ask for a license key, so we'll have to use this option and then enter in a key before we're able to activate this server. Now we can also use the ATO switch, and this will activate this server after we've installed our product key, and we can use the -DLI and -DLV switches to display information about our license. Now if we use the -XPR switch, we can see what the current expiration date is for our server core installation. So let's go and click on OK here and dismiss this little dialog box, and we'll enter in the slmgr command followed by -xpr, and we'll hit enter. And this will pop up another little window here telling us when our server core installation is set to expire, unless of course we go ahead and activate it. So let's go and activate Windows, but before we do that we'll need to enter in our product key. So we'll again rerun our slmgr command followed by the -IPK switch, and that simply stands for install product key, and then we'll need to enter in our 25-digit product key, including all of the hyphens. So I'm going to pause the video here, and I'm going to enter in my product key and simply hit enter. Alright, now that my product key has been entered, to activate Windows Server Core, we'll run slmgr command again with the -ATO switch, and we'll hit enter. And if in the previous step you did enter in a valid product key, you'll see that the product will be activated successfully. Okay, so we've now successfully activated our server core installation of Windows 2008. So now that this has all been configured, we're now able to move on to other videos in this series where we'll see how to configure various roles on our server core server. So to log off this server, we can simply type in log off. In this video, we've seen how we can install Windows 2008 Server Core and how to configure the basic framework by changing the hostname using the netdom command, as well as the IP address, default gateway, and DNS address using the netsh command. We also saw how we can use the netdom command to add our Server Core server to our domain and how to update the registry so that our Windows firewall will now accept incoming remote desktop connections from a Windows Vista machine and Windows Server 2008 machine, as well as XP and 2003 machines also. And finally, we learned that we could use the shutdown command to shut down or restart our server and the logoff command to log off from our server's session. We hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for supporting Winstructor.